Yeah, good afternoon from Europe to Africa and especially from Germany to Ghana. Today I'm reading a new chapter of Kwame Nkrumah, The African Background. Yeah, English reading lessons with Laura Celestina. If I finish this book, I'll be much better, I promise. The African Background. Colonialism and its attitudes die hard, like the attitude of slavery, whose hangover still dominates behavior in certain parts of the Western Hemisphere. Before slavery was practiced in the New World, there was no special denigration of Africans. Travelers to this continent described the inhabitants in their records with the national curiosity and examination to be expected of individuals coming from other environments. It was when the slave trade and the slavery began to develop the ghastly proportions that made them the base of that capital accumulation which assisted the rise of Western industrialism that a new attitude towards Africans emerged. Slavery in the Caribbean has been too narrowly identified with the man of color. A racial twist has thereby been given to what is basically an economic phenomenon. Slavery was not born of racism. Rather, racism was the consequence of slavery. With this racial twist was invented the myth of color inferiority. With this racial twist was invented the myth of color inferiority. This might supported the subsequent rape of our continent with its depopulating and continuing exploitation under the advanced forms of colonialism and imperialism. It was during the period that has come to be called the opening up of Africa that there began to spring up a school of what some verified African nationalists have dubbed imperialist anthropologists, whose ranks extend down to the present time. Their works are aimed at proving the inferiority of the African. Anything of value that has been uncovered in Africa is attributed by them to the influence of some allegedly superior group within the continent or to people from outside Africa. The idea that Africa can have exerted any civilizing influence over other people is shunned or denied. Of late, another school of thought is reassessing the evidence and applying more objective standards of judgment. Some historians and anthropologists that think that civilization dawned contemporaneously in Africa and in China. Very much exploration for further evidence which will determine the early history of man in Africa remains to be done. L.S.B. Leakey, The Progress and Evolution of Man in Africa, 1961, The Progress of Man in Africa, has this to say, : in every country that one visits and where one is drawn into conversation about Africa, the question is regularly asked by people who should know better. But what has Africa contributed to world progress? Not the wheel, not writing, not mathematics, not art, not this, not that, and not the other thing. ... These critics of Africa forget that the men of science today are, with few exceptions, satisfied that Africa was the birthplace of man himself, and that for many hundreds of centuries thereafter Africa was in the forefront of all world progress. Yeah, of course. It is certain that the origins of European culture trace their roots to the ancient civilizations of the Nile Valley. Early geographers and chroniclers speak of well-organized African states and empires on both sides of the continent. North Africa before the Islamic invasion, inhabited by the Tuareg and Berber people, maintained flourishing societies and centers of trade. It was with the spread of Islam that the mass Arab drive reached into Africa's northern belt as well as Egypt. From the discovery of written records in Arabic going back as far as the 9th century, we are learning something of Africans' past. They tell us that Ghana was already a centralized state in AD 800. 8.D.800. This kingdom, whose center lay some 200 miles north of the watershed between the Senegal and Niger rivers, was one of the earliest of West African kingdoms. True, Ghana was seriously weakened by the Almoravid invasion of the 11th century. Its traditions of government and empire did not die. They reached even greater heights in the successor state of Mali, which flourished in the 14th century, and which possessed intellectual centers such as Chien and Timbuktu, whose colleges could exchange scholars with Spain and other parts of the Muslim world. When Mali declined, it was replaced by the just as splendid Songhai Empire of Gao, while farther to the east lay the great state of Kanem, with a monarchy almost as ancient as that of Ghana, which continued steadfastly into the 19th century. Books like the Tariq as-Sudan and the Tariq el-Fatah, written by the African scholars of Timbuktu in the 16th and 17th centuries, give graphic description of still existing Sudanese states of power and prestige. One of the great writers of Islam, Ibn Battuta, touring through Mali in the middle of the 14th century, observed of his people that they are seldom unjust and have a greater abhorrence of injustice than any other people. Their sultan shows no mercy to anyone who is guilty of the last act of it. there is complete security in their country. Neither traveler nor inhabitant in it has anything to fear from robbers or men of violence. They do not confiscate the property of any white man who dies in their country, even if it be uncounted wealth. On the contrary, they give it into the charge of some trustworthy person among the whites until the rightful heir takes possession of it. Oh God, this Kwame. Nkrumah was so big studied. Could as much be said for our European contemporaries of that time? Could as much be said for our European contemporaries of that time? Europe was then passing into its Renaissance. It was awakening from the social torpor of medievalism and divided into petty and quarrelsome kingdoms. Capitalism was on the uprise, and seafaring adventurers were starting out on their centuries-long search for gold and spices and silks, slaves and ivory, that they might plunder them for money-hungry monarchs and traders. These voyages brought them to the coast of Africa. Originally, the African coastline was explored by Phoenician and Greek sailors, and there is growing knowledge of Chinese contact with the East Coast going back at least to the early 12th century. The modern period of exploration may be said to have begun with the Portuguese voyages during the time of Prince Henry the Navigator, 1394 till 1460, 100 years almost. Bartolome Diaz sailed round the Cape of Good Hope in 1488, and some 10 years later, Vasco da Gama touched on the Kenya coast on his way to India. What kind of people, what kind of cities did these plunderers find? Basil Davidson, adducing evidence from authentic records of the time, sums up the scene thus. Double point. They anchored in havens that were thick with ocean shipping. They went ashore to cities as fine as all but a few they could have known in Europe. They watched a flourishing maritime trade in gold and iron and ivory and tortoise shell, beads and copper and cotton clothes, slaves and porcelain, and saw that they had stumbled on a world of commerce even larger and perhaps wealthier than anything that Europe knew. To these European sailors of the last years of the 15th century, the coast of Eastern Africa could have seemed no less civilized. Again, Africa could have seemed no less civilized than their own coast of Portugal. In the matter of wealth and knowledge of a wider world, it must have seemed a great deal more civilized. They were repeatedly surprised by the ease and substance of the ports and towns they saw and sheltered in and plundered. They found themselves repeatedly disregarded as strange and uncaught. When we had been 2 or 3 days at this place, says the laconic logbook of the Gama's flagship, the Sao Gabriel, of an encounter at a port that was probably Quelimane, above the Zambezi River. 2 Zen horses of the country came to see us. They were very haughty and valued nothing which we gave them. One of them wore a cap with a fringe embroidered in silk, and the other a cap of green silk. A young man in their company, so we understood from their signs, had come from a distant country and had already seen big ships like ours. This was the Africa these plundering sailors found, an Africa of fair and thriving cities, whose inhabitants allowed them unimpeded entry, so their own undoing for the strangers. Schooled in the bitter rivalries of Europe, fell upon these tolerant and easygoing civilizations of the Indian Ocean with a ferocity and violence that were like nothing seen there through many countries. All this was as easy for the Portuguese, and for much the same reasons as it was in India whenever they met with resistance to their greed and theft. They were better armed, they were trained to ruthlessness, they wanted more than a simple monopoly of trade, ruinous. True, that would be for the coastal cities. They wanted lot as well. African warfare, like Indian warfare, was designed to minimize casualties, not maximize them. These invaders had no such care. Yeah. This was part 1 of the African background. Part 2 will follow soon. Okay. Have a nice day. Bye-bye.